Jason heard heavy knocks on the plane's glass all of a sudden. He was clueless as to what was happening. He was anxiously searching about, and when the cabin staff informed him, his co-pilot gasped. When Jason learned that a massive flock of birds was pursuing and attacking the jet, he was very perplexed. They just kept coming. This might turn out to be a complete catastrophe, he thought. Shaking the birds was Jason's attempt, but he had to exercise caution since the whole aircraft may crash if they struck the engines. The more Jason shook the birds, the more hostile they became. Even though Jason didn't know what was causing it, things kept getting worse. From what he overheard from the flight attendants, things grew angry when the birds wouldn't leave the aircraft alone. Birds were feared to allow the jet to crash for this reason. Jason reassured his other travelers that everything was normal and under control. However, the inverse was in fact true. When Jason needed aid, he had to ask for it. To find out his alternatives, Jason had to contact flight control. He sensed that the birds were getting closer to the point where they may bring down the airliner. The avian population grew and the birds became more hostile. Unfortunately, there was a hitch. Jason's co-pilot Jimmy swiveled around to look at Jason. Jason realized he did not have good news to share. To no avail, he tried calling the control tower. No one responded, but Jason was adamant that he keep trying. He alerted the flight attendants, who then had to soothe the agitated passengers. Birds were so thick outside that the passengers rarely got a glimpse of the world outside. The whole aircraft was plunged into darkness, creating a tense atmosphere. All of the passengers suddenly felt a tremendous chill. Indeed, a few of them began sobbing openly. Jason needed to move quickly. Jason strained his muscles to shake the birds loose and get some height on the jet. The aircraft and its passengers would be in risk if he attempted a too steep ascent. More importantly, there were so many birds that they began directing the aircraft downward. Jimmy's mouth dropped open at the sight of the approaching structures. They had reached a critically unsafe altitude above the city. Jason was able to safely guide the jet to the countryside thanks to the plane's controls. It dawned on him that trying to get higher would be pointless. It was imperative that he return to the airport and land the jet. However, how? During this time, the cabin staff was busy assisting the guests. In fact, several of them were already standing up. They finally broke down and got some help. Some people seemed to be completely immobilized. The situation was a mystery to everyone. At last, Jimmy was told to do a U-turn and go to the closest landing strip. They were instructed by air traffic control to reroute to a more local, smaller airfield. Not wasting any time, Jason swung the aircraft around. The situation had escalated rapidly and was now quite perilous. When they steered the aircraft around, it smacked into a few birds, so much so that it seemed to further inflame their anger. Small fractures appeared in the panes as the birds continued to strike the structure. Jason learned that rescue workers were on their way to the airfield. To get to the airstrip, all Jason had to do was make sure he could get there. Then, and only then, could they be of assistance. To avoid crashing, he had to use all of his efforts. Once they moved out into the countryside, though, things became considerably worse. As soon as Jason left the city limits, he saw that the airstrip would deteriorate worse in the last stretch. Several more birds appeared out of the neighboring woods. The aircraft drew their attention right away. There was a sense of impending doom that seized Jason. Jason saw that the closer the birds came near the plane's engines, the more they attacked. It would be bad if a lot of birds flew into the motors. Jason had the goal of getting to the strip in his sights when he heard a loud crash. Jason could scarcely keep the aircraft from swaying as it began to shake. Additionally, the aircraft was descending rapidly. The passengers also became aware of this, and they began to scream in alarm. The worst-case scenario was really unfolding. Unfortunately, the engine failed. Jason felt his heart racing. He was completely oblivious to his surroundings since he was so intent on his task at hand. The jet had completely lost altitude at this point and was crashing to the ground. There was only one possibility that Jason could think of. There was nothing left to do except fire this last bullet. Because of an unexpected problem, Jason had to make a quick landing. This was something he'd never done before. The only exposure he had to it had been in theoretical contexts via simulations during his studies. He thought it was his responsibility to guarantee the security of everyone on board. His eyes suddenly opened to a new sight. As he descended, he saw a body of water below him and determined that he would just barely be able to land there. Ultimately, this was their last chance of survival. Tackling a difficult landing, the aircraft would very certainly crash as a result. Jason piloted the aircraft to a very narrow water landing. There was no cushioning for the fall, and it kept the aircraft from shattering to bits. For him, the most important thing was making sure everyone on board was safe. Then he heard a woman scream. People inside the vehicle were the ones who started screaming. Shock and dread gripped them. After a little pause, Jason was able to free himself from his seat and walk about. Jason helped Jimmy, who was barely awake, get onto the aircraft. There was an emergency among the cabin personnel. The crew did their best to maintain composure, and all outward appearances indicated that they were successful. Even after opening the emergency doors, they saw that the birds were still swarming the aircraft. If they let everyone go, what would happen? They had to leave the aircraft immediately. The only option was to leave. Jason attempted to force open an escape but was unsuccessful. Due to his exhaustion and desperation, he began to show his feelings. One of the flight attendants was able to open the emergency escape. With time on their side, they managed to evacuate everyone from the sinking jet. The crew did their best to calm everyone down, but there were still some passengers who wanted to get off the ship first and didn't care about anybody else. Something they deeply and quickly regretted. The first persons to leave the building were immediately attacked by the birds. When they all dove in together, nobody bothered them. The aircraft was even hit by a flock of birds. Most of their hostility was directed at the area around the baggage claim. Where did they hide it? Everyone had to leave first before anybody could answer this question. Jason jumped into the ocean last, but the Coast Guard was on its way just in time to rescue everyone. At the sight of the aircraft, the birds immediately began circling the sky in a frantic pattern. That descended gradually into the pool. All swimmers were escorted to shore by the Coast Guard. There were now more boats coming to save everyone. Those on board kept directing attention to the plane's wreckage. Jason had a startled expression as he turned around. The birds continued to circle the aircraft endlessly. Seemed like they were probing the inside for something. Clearly, Jason was perplexed. In all honesty, he had no clue what might make so many birds behave so strangely. When the Coast Guard attempted to intervene, however, things quickly deteriorated. The birds became increasingly wary of our approach as we grew closer to them. It seems that they had no intention of allowing the Coast Guard any closeness to the jet. The Coast Guard, however, proved to be quite unyielding. They sailed closer to the island despite Jason's warnings. As soon as they drew close to the wreck, the birds swarmed them. That was enough to make the sailors abandon their ships in terror. It was a long swim back to the other boats, but they made it. Nobody on board, even the flight attendants, could figure it out. And what exactly was on board the aircraft anyway? There must be a method to make the birds go. That aircraft disaster would be inaccessible to them otherwise. There was a need for a strategy. As a result of needing to check the aircraft, it had to be pulled out of the water. It was imperative that we not delay. Husky tugboats were on their way to pull the jet from the ocean. However, they had been informed by the Coast Guard about the flock of birds. Like the earlier vessel, this one did not seem to be very concerned about the birds. However, they really should. The birds immediately began swarming once again as they approached. Workers saw a darkening of the sky due to birds. They knew they would have to wait because of this. So that the birds would be properly frightened, they phoned for backup. Indeed, this was the one viable option. This time, the birds crowded the ships as they approached a greater distance. People rushed the crew members who had ventured outdoors. They were lucky in that they were able to get inside immediately. Since the tugboats couldn't be reached by the birds, they were able to draw closer. Thankfully, Jason devised a solution. He had learned that airports use loud noises to chase away birds. The birds might be scared away, he assured the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard reacted quickly, blasting their speakers at maximum volume, and then an event occurred. Those birdies indeed respond to the shrill sounds and fly back into the woods. If the Coast Guard paused right now, the birds would fly back. They needed this window of opportunity to successfully pull the aircraft out of the ocean. The Coast Guard provided directions so that the tugboats could successfully secure their cables to the jet. Immediately, they began to tug. Fortunately, towing the aircraft wasn't a problem. Sooner or later, the aircraft would be thoroughly inspected. And then the cops showed up. Since Jason was the pilot, he was the first person the authorities questioned. Seeing as how Jason had nothing to conceal, he just informed the authorities that it was a routine trip. He has been able to make this flight almost every week with no problems. No one has ever done this before today. As soon as the jet doors opened, he saw the birds headed straight towards the hold. What occurred today could be revealed by looking into this. When the authorities questioned Jason about the bags, he pointed them in the direction of the passengers. They'd know for sure what to do next. In spite of their shock, the passengers were cooperatively addressing the police's queries concerning their belongings. There was an exception, though. The cops had to pull one individual aside. The motivations of this one traveler were cloudy at best. He seemed to contradict himself in almost every statement. The police took this action quite seriously. When they inquired about his bags, he avoided their questions. There was an investigation into his past. This has brought up even more inquiries. A closer look reveals that his passport is probably forged. This can't end well. Fingerprints were the only means of positively identifying him at this point. A hit was returned. When this was entered into the database, this guy had just been released from prison. Because the government had sealed his files, nobody knew what they were dealing with. However, red flags of every kind were raised. They still needed to determine what he was delivering and why the birds were reacting to it. Thankfully, the aircraft was rescued from the ocean. A dedicated research crew showed up to the area to conduct a thorough investigation. However, there were a lot of noises to contend with before they could board the aircraft. The birds knew the ships had gone far away and were now just a distant sound. They flocked to the aircraft crash without delay. The authorities believed they were attempting to enter the baggage claim area. As a result, the study team was able to go into closer proximity to the speakers. The birds flew away and they got into the aircraft. As the aircraft was completely damaged, it was difficult to go near the bags. The door was locked, but unique equipment allowed them to free themselves. Soon after they entered, they heard a noise. Sounds came from the direction of the baggage counter that were cause for anxiety. As they got closer to the bags, they were able to identify which ones had been making the noise. Everyone in the room gasped as they saw what was inside. They promptly contacted authorities to report the suspicious passenger for arrest. The name on the bag matched the one on the passport he used to check in, proving that it was his. Bags were removed off the aircraft with great care by the study team. Jason hurried up to them, but as he saw what was inside, he quickly became pale. The individual, he deduced, was involved in the illegal trade of exotic birds. They were able to learn the specifics of the man's detention after placing a call to further law enforcement. He had been arrested once previously for attempting to smuggle exotic animals. After being let free, he immediately resumed his life as normal. Jason's feelings were hurt. The individual was eventually arrested and would never be free to go again. The passenger's safety was also cited as a reason to press charges against him. The exotic birds were pleading for aid, and the birds responded by attacking the aircraft. At the conclusion of the trial, Jason broke down in tears of joy. He was pleased to find out that everyone was okay.